Terese, thank you so much for agreeing to chat. I think to start, I just would love to hear kind of any of your thoughts about the most important, the things that you think are most important with regards to the history of houselessness, whether that be nationwide or in Denver specifically, anything that you think that people interested in engaging in this topic should know.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's one of the most important places to start and really to have a sense of what houselessness or homelessness is. It actually is, because our society has a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions and lies and other stories told about why people are homeless and who's homeless and how homelessness started. Um, and we have to look back at the real history. Um, so yeah, so we haven't always had mass homelessness in the U.S. Um, there's been two major episodes of mass homelessness. One during the Great Depression, and the second being now, starting in the early '80s. And the mass homelessness that we have now is proportionally greater um, with the population than it was even during the Great Depression. We have more people who are homeless now than than even back then. So really, we have the biggest episode of mass homelessness in the U.S. Right in this time, and it started really in the early '80s when the federal government decided that they were going to slash all of the investment of federal government in low income and public housing. And prior to that, jumping back to the Great Depression era, that funding from the federal level for public low income housing is what got us out of the mass homelessness that was during the Great Depression. The New Deal and similar programs really created a public housing stock that gave people options of somewhere to live that they could afford. Was it perfect? No. Was there a lot of racist policies involved in where they were placed and so on? Yes, there was definitely some serious issues with some of the creation of the public housing through the New Deal, mostly in terms of like the redlining that went on with that and so on. But that was the first major investment in public housing that lasted all of that time up until the early '80s, where you could find somewhere that was public housing kept at an affordable rate that you could afford. And then in the early '80s, they decided we're going to slash all that. We don't care about investing in housing. People should make their own way and pay for their own housing and so on, and slashed it 77%. So the budget was cut down to almost nothing, and then within the next few years, cut down to nothing, to where now there's literally zero federal dollars going into new public housing, new creation of public housing.
Wow.
The federal dollars that go into housing subsidies are all through voucher programs, Section 8, other sorts of subsidies, and so on. That is a combination of market rate housing with these government subsidies, and that continues to lead us to a place where we don't have attainable housing because the markets continue to rise, housing prices continue to rise. That's just the plain facts of how the market works, and There's no public housing stock that's kept affordable. So at the same time as the funding for low income public housing was slashed 77% through the federal government between 1978 and 1983. At that same time is when you start to see a mass rise in homelessness in the U.S. You start to see the shelter systems opening up at large across the nation. And that that mass homelessness has continued to rise. Before the early 80s, there was only a small number of sort of like emergency shelters that were really intended for different kinds of purposes than homelessness. They were mostly for people that were runaways or people that were in like domestic abuse crises or folks who were in prostitution, the different kinds of focuses, but not mass shelters for folks who just don't have housing. And then in the early 80s, you see this mass spread of the shelters, which started out really as a very admirable response of good-hearted people to say, hey, there's people sleeping on our streets, and we need to get them into somewhere safe and dry and warm. And so churches and buildings and so on would start to open up their doors. And initially, actually, there was a lot of FEMA money that was used for the sheltering in the early years in the 80s. And then that became the new norm. So instead of looking at this mass homelessness and saying, oh, we have a crisis that was created by this destruction of low-income housing that we just defunded and continue to then destroy, like literally demolish public housing, SROs and other cheap options. Instead of saying, hey, we need to bring back housing, people are on the streets, there's a direct correlation. They said, oh, well, we need to invest in a homelessness system. And so this whole homeless industrial complex with all of the homeless system became the response. When you see like in the 90s and stuff, like the McKinney-Vito assistance grant money and other like homeless assistance grants money that are focused on serving homeless people, not on creating housing options to get us out of this crisis in the first place. That was by and large the response to mass homelessness. And that is how it's continued ever since. And it doesn't work. These homeless management systems and various ways of trying to serve homeless people out of homelessness without creating the housing that's attainable as anywhere in the pipeline. That's been the approach that continues on to this day. And again, it doesn't work, as we can tell, as we can see, that we continue to have mass homelessness. So I'll shut up and see if you want to redirect my ramble.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. I've been actually thinking about what you were talking about towards the end there a lot recently, because I mean, thinking of myself included as like working for a nonprofit, I've been thinking about like all of the money that we funnel into these nonprofits, into these shelters to, like you were saying, like try to serve people out of homelessness. Do you think, like, instead of just putting that money towards affordable housing and towards attainable housing, do you think that shift kind of in strategy, if you will, comes from a belief, or where do you think that comes from? Because I think it partly comes from us looking at people who are experiencing houselessness as like, oh, this is an individual problem. Like you as an individual can get yourself out of this if you really want to. Is there any, like, do you think that that is partly where that shift in strategy comes from? Or is there anything else that you think is at play
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like on a fundamental level, it is very much based on this um, individual approach that everything should be individualized. Each individual is a different situation. Each individual has to pull themselves by their own bootstraps. They have their own unique circumstances, and so on. Which sure, everybody's an individual, but that doesn't change the universal need for safe, decent, affordable housing. That's not an
Yeah.
individual thing. That's a universal thing, and like it doesn't change the market as long as they continue to treat it as an individual problem, and have some sort of a God knows how this assumption comes that idea that somebody can pull them up by their bootstraps in this economy and this society, with all of the obstacles that are in place, is totally insane. Um,
Yeah.
and really, I think the other piece of it though is that it's not just like this individualized approach, um, which can have some logical good heart to it. Like, oh yes, each individual is unique. Sure, yeah, and we want to treat people as individuals. All of those
Yeah.
things kind of are natural, uh, but where I think where it really breaks down is this individualized approach is accompanied by the drive for profit and capitalism, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, so like that's not the only reason that the shift happened. Where like they didn't, like, in the early '80s when they slashed the funding for public housing. I don't think they did it just because they were like, oh, we need people to be individuals and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's part of the narrative, but the other part of it is, and we want to make more profit
Right.
on developments, and have the ability to have the free market reign with our market housing.
Yeah.
So
Like we want to be able to get something out of this housing investment instead of just giving it away.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think both of those things work together in terms of um, why this sort of approach to homelessness was created and continues to perpetuate.
Right. And I think that this approach to like houselessness in and of itself kind of further perpetuates that narrative of, oh, people end up on the streets because of their choices, because they suffer from mental illness, because they experience like drug addiction. I feel like they kind of, those two things mutually reinforce each other, where if you have the system that's trying to treat people as individuals to say, come on, like you got to get yourself out of this, then that fuels that belief of, oh, these are individual choices that have led you to this place. So therefore you can get yourself out of it. And so it's just kind of
Yeah,
this cycle. What would you
exactly.
say to those things? And why, do you have any insight as to like why people end up on the streets in the first place? Like, are those stereotypes of, oh, people end up on the streets because of choices, because of mental illness, because of drug addiction? Are those things actually true? Or are there other things at play?
Yeah. So I mean, like, life is so crazy complex, and there's so much that goes on for all of us in every stage of life. So I think I like to look at it in terms of like social safety nets and economic safety nets, um, uh, that can be catalysts for um, losing a housing option, um, and then uh, like underneath that is this complete absence of attainable housing options, that give you no way to get back, or very difficult and few ways to get back out of that situation. So like if you're somebody who has a strong family and a community that is helping look out for you and that can have your back and put you up for a while you're dealing with a rough time and getting a new job or whatever. um, you're going to have that safety net, that social safety net to be able to not land on the streets. But if you don't have that social safety net, that family or community or whatever, um, when you lose your job or break up with your partner or what have you, um, you don't have anybody to turn to, or you turn to somebody and then that falls through, and then you turn to another person that falls through. Ultimately, you run out of options, and you have to return to the streets. And um, if you have an economic safety net like if you have no social safety net but you have an economic safety net, then you may not have to turn to the streets because you have this inheritance, or you have this whole background of privilege of income from whatever your family history or whatever, um, that you can turn to that economic safety net to help you find a place to rent it, or whatever. Um, or if you just have an economic safety net, but so those things really work hand in hand, and especially if you have neither of those, neither an economic safety net or a social safety net, or sometimes if you just have one, but different circumstances, you're really you end up with no options. You end up screwed and on the streets.
Yeah.
And like, that's not something that's abnormal to humankind. That's something that we all can go through, no matter what your income, what your situation. We all can go through those kinds of crises, but we need supports to get through it. And so, yeah, I mean, and then I think in conjunction with that, the more you have going against you, the more likely you are to not have a way out of that and to land on the streets, and end up staying on the streets. So whether that be because of oppression against you due to race, that like long history of not having family wealth because of being being discriminated against or redlined or whatever due to
not owning property.
Not having property. All of these like long systemic causes of the roots of poverty and racism and so on, obviously go right into this likelihood that you're more likely to not have those social safety nets or economic safety nets to keep you from landing in homelessness. And similar with all sorts of other things, with you're struggling with a mental health issue, or if you are somebody who's LGBTQ and you're getting kicked out by your parents for not identifying the way they want you to. All these sorts of things can definitely add to that, and that's really what we see on the streets. We see that anybody can end up homeless, but folks who have more and more layers of oppression are more and more likely to land on the streets.
Yeah. And I think it's easier for us as a society to identify people who are living life on the streets, to say like, oh, it's your fault that you've ended up there, because then we can say, oh, that's great, now we don't have to do anything about it, when that's just not the reality at all. Yeah, that's fascinating. What would you say are some of the biggest misunderstandings that people have about those who are experiencing houselessness?
I think the biggest one is just what we've been talking about, that it's an individual problem and that you should pull yourself out of it as an individual. That's just simply not true. Yes, of course, there's individual problems. Of course, people have individual struggles and so on. But that's just not the ultimate cause or the ultimate solution. Um, and again, we all have individual problems, but if we have those options available where you can have somewhere you can afford to rent, you're you're more likely to be able to do that. And I think another just major misconception is the idea that people choose to be homeless. It's only true of a very, very small percentage. Yes, there is definitely some people who are like, no, this is the life for me. But you really have to look at choice between what, because when you're choosing between staying with an abusive partner or staying with a family that is being, hateful or abusive towards you, or or traveling across the country away from your community, or any number of these kind of shitty choices that people have, choosing to live on the streets versus one of those situations,
sure,
often makes a lot of sense. So yeah, they may say, oh yeah, I'm choosing this, but that's because your other choices are all super shitty. And so between a menu of shitty options, maybe life on the streets is better than those other options, but that's not to say that that's their prime choice. That's not to say that that's what most of these people would say is this is my what I really want to do, even if I had a good housing option that really met my needs and was appropriate and so on. And it from all of our data on that topic, it's clear, or at least 80, if not 90%. It looks like, if not 95 or more, but are folks who want housing, that they would prefer housing.
Sure.
But only if it were accessible and appropriate and so on. We do various surveys about this. So we've gotten a few different small surveys, have actually all come back with somewhere around 88%, which is interesting. That same number keeps popping up of 88% of people we survey want housing. And that's also kind of reflective of the number of folks who get housing and stay in it. So if in terms of like the data on people that move into permanent supportive housing, which isn't for everybody because there is various kind of rules and restrictions that come with that. But even with that, 89% of people that move into that kind of housing stay in it. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at a high percentage of folks who are homeless that don't want to be homeless, and when given the opportunity to actually have housing, take it and stay in it. Of course, that's not everybody, but like to throw an entire population under the bus, with when a handful of folks do actually prefer that, or that does work better for them, and then say that means that everybody is choosing this,
right?
And criminalize them or treat them like trash because of it. Is really problematic.
Yeah, because you wouldn't do that you wouldn't do that about house people. Like, you wouldn't say like someone. I'm just always struck by the narrative that people who live on the streets are inherently more dangerous, or are inherently more violent, or things like that. And I just think about people I know who live in homes that I don't trust, that I don't necessarily feel safe being around. And, think about like, I wouldn't have an experience with that one person and say, oh, everyone who lives in a home, who lives under a shelter is unsafe or is dangerous. Like, we would never do it in the reverse.
Yeah, and that is another good one, of course, is that narrative that people are homeless or dangerous. It's just not an accurate representation of the homeless population whatsoever. I mean, and the way that narrative plays out, where it's like, um, oh, these people are dangerous, therefore I don't want to be around them, and we need to, get them out of sight, out of mind. It's like, are you even thinking of the people in that community and their safety? Like that, like if somebody, felt unsafe in an environment, it would be the ones who are most directly in it,
Mm-hmm.
and and when we just don't even like look at like asking people at an encampment or at an area or whatever, like, how safe do you feel? What would make you feel safer?
Sure.
I think that's a really just, it never happens. We never look at it that way, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. Is there anything in particular about Denver specifically in the dynamics of houselessness in our city that you think would be important for people to know that may be different than like the national landscape, or maybe not even different, or just like more pronounced than it might be, things might be elsewhere? Anything like that that comes to mind?
Uh, well, a lot of this is pretty natural, but I think it's really important for folks to be aware of just how bad our laws are. That they're so, in addition to not having um, housing as an option and treating shelters as the long-term solution to homelessness,
Mm.
uh, uh, in effort to push people out of sight, out of mind, and not have that visible homelessness that really reveals the failures of our nation. Um, Cities across the nation pass laws that make it a crime to be, visibly homeless, and they do that with a lot of different, strategies, lots of different unique laws that they use. Here in Denver, we have a number of those types of laws. The most egregious and most horrifying of them all is a law called the unauthorized camping ban that literally makes it illegal to use any form of protection from the elements other than your clothing. So
Mm.
that's literally what the law says. You can't temporarily reside, meaning like sit down or lay down anywhere in the city of Denver, um, and use any sort of cover. That includes sitting on a piece of cardboard, cover yourself with a blanket, anything. Um, and they enforce this law. Um, they enforce it widely across the city. In in the last whatever it's been, 8 years or something since it passed in 2012, um, there's been over 12,000 people contacted um,
Wow.
to be forced to move for the camping ban. Each year, there's roughly 5,000 contacts. Um, it's and like of like contacts with some of which being the same individual, but
Sure.
anyway, it's enforced on a constant basis. Used to tell people to move to get out of sight, out of mind, and it it's really detrimental, because folks need to be somewhere, need to be able to set up some stability and some community. Um, so um, yeah, that law is in a lot of cities, but it's here in Denver. We have been fighting it for a long time. We actually won in court recently, in 2019. Um, and the local judge found the law unconstitutional because it's cruel and unusual punishment to tell people with no other option that you're a criminal for using cover when you have to do that to survive. But that was a lower court ruling, and the city appealed it to a higher court, and so now it's still in place as we're waiting to to fight it in the higher court. Currently, due to COVID, things are on delay.
Oh,
But
sure. I had wondered what had happened with that, but that makes sense. It's been delayed.
yeah, but it's I mean, the paperwork is moving forward. It's just going to take a little while.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's one case like many. There's actually other cases like it across the nation where these types of laws have been found unconstitutional. Um, there's other laws they use too, but ultimately it's just whatever means possible of trying to treat folks like criminals, push folks out of sight, have a tool to get people away when they don't want them in public space. Yeah.
Yeah. And it just breaks my heart witnessing the effect that has on people because, I mean, time and time again, like the people we come in contact with are told to move along. They're told you don't belong here. This place isn't for you. And I've just witnessed, even over the course of just a couple years, people who have recently ended up on the streets to flash forward like 2 years later, how their like sense of self and their sense of self-worth has just been chipped away at like over time by these policies and by these regulations trying to tell them like that they don't belong and that they don't have a place here. um yeah, it's been disheartening to see the not only just like legal results of those types of laws but also the results that it has on people's like sense of humanity and sense of worth too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody wants to read more on that topic, like the human effects, health and safety effects, um, we have a report we did called "Unhealthy by Design" that surveys over 500 people who are
Oh
homeless and
yes.
different about the effects of the law and really talks about those types of things.
Great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. For people who are in and around Denver, um, if they find themselves wanting to make a difference with regards to how Denver approaches houselessness, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, that's a good question. There's lots to do. Uh,
There's plenty of things.
yeah. So really, one of the big things is speaking up, is being an advocate, not being quiet. So, whether that's through, uh, calling out the mayor or city council or um, those sorts of, political officials, being loud to them, being present, showing up at the council meetings where these issues are being talked about, or just showing up and identifying yourself as somebody who lives in the community um, and cares about your neighbors and doesn't want them to be criminalized and hidden, um, and wants them to have access to housing and so on. That's huge. Neighborhood meetings, any of these sorts of spheres where a lot of the decisions and are made around that affect the daily life of folks who don't have housing. Being a loud and clear advocate in those spaces is one of the biggest things you can do. And in terms of like direct support to individuals on the street or in shelters or without housing, I would say there's so much need, so much that can be done. But I think getting to know folks and having good relationships is huge. Having a way of having a mutual relationship where you're learning from them and you're supporting each other. And life on the streets is hard. Housing is nice for a reason. It's because it gives you climate control, it gives you protection from the elements, it gives you bathrooms, it gives you all of these things that you don't have on the streets. And so just putting yourself in that place for a minute and thinking about the privilege of a house and what happens without that, maybe even learning from somebody on the streets about that, and then sharing what you can in those regards. So whether that's water or tents or sleeping bags or tarps, um, uh, food, rides, places, so on and so forth. There's just so many basic daily needs that that folks have on the streets that you don't have if you live in a house. Sharing your space as much as you can in terms of letting folks use the shower or get some rest for a while, or so many different options. But yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's those are two big buckets of work, and getting involved with organizations to stay plugged in, stay connected, but remembering that the service provider world has kind of ingrained a deep perspective of individuals as just needing that sort of individual help or charity, and not looking at the systemic level. So bringing in that systemic approach to the service world, if you're working with a church or something like that, is really critical.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning both of those things, because I think I had a conversation with a pastor a while back, and they would do a meal for people, and we had this conversation because he was like, I know that things need to structurally change. Like, people need housing, and that's not gonna, feeding them a meal is not gonna give them housing, in a roundabout way. Like, they physically need housing. But then he also said, like, in the meantime though, like, they do need food and they do need all of these things. So I think it's definitely important what you're saying, to do those things, like partnering with organizations who are feeding people and attending to their basic needs right now, but not losing sight of the fact that bigger structures have to change. And that's what's gonna, like, really bring more life to the situation as it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, appreciate that. Is following Denver Homeless Out Loud's Facebook page a good way for people to stay involved with what you all are doing?
Yeah, you can follow Denver Homeless Out Loud Facebook page, or Twitter, or Instagram. Also our website. You can email us at info@denverhomelessoutloud.org. And yeah, those are good ways to stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, great. Well, I super appreciate all the things that y'all do to not only empower people who are on the streets and to, live life alongside them, but also to empower those of us who do live under a roof to be engaged with all of this, and to demand that our city does things differently and actually gives people what they need and supports people in the ways that they need. So I appreciate y'all's leadership in that, and very much enjoy following y'all in the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And thanks for all that you do.
Yeah. Of course.
We're all fighting hard. I know it.
Yeah.
It's a big obstacle. It's a lot.
Doing what we can. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for chatting. I super appreciate it.
Yeah.